Now, with a fresh wave of strikes underway on the railways today, new data shows that the impact industrial action is having on the economy pretty significant. The number of working days lost to strike action hit the highest level for a decade in October. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, is here. Ed, we've been showing a calendar on Sky News for the past few weeks of just how packed December is when it comes to strike action. It feels like there's something pretty much every day until the new year. What kind of pressure is that putting on the economy then?
Well, let me show you. And it's worth saying, there's been so much talk from both sides, from the government, from those public sector unions as well. But you've really kind of got to dig down into the data to get a kind of clear sense of what's going on. And one of those pieces of data, you're right, was just updated. This is kind of the state of just how many days we're losing to strikes. This is backward-looking. It's worth just saying that, and you can kind of get a sense of that by, looking at this period here. That's the 60s and the 70s, when you had loads of days lost to strikes. Where we are now, it doesn't really look that high, does it? So the data just from June to October, because some of the data wasn't collected over COVID, so they only just started recollecting it recently. But even in that short period, over 1 million days lost to industrial action. That, though, is still kind of well below where you're, 2011, which, of course, was a really big year for strikes. That was during the kind of austerity period. But worth noting, that's before a lot of the extra strikes that we're talking about now are due to happen. So in December, you could see that line kind of going up really quite high indeed. But another way of kind of looking at this is looking at the number of stoppages. So this is just kind of an arithmetic total of how many stoppages there are across the economy at any given time. And actually already in this period that, like I say, it's backwards looking. We're not talking about this Christmas. We're talking about what we had in the previous months. It's already up to the highest level that we've seen since 1988. So it's already getting there, and that line's going up. But, it's nothing, is it, compared to that period that was the kind of winter of discontent, and that whole period of the 60s and the 70s. That was pretty high. So there are some definite historical parallels, but we're kind of, got a long way to travel on that.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's consistent throughout history is people are striking over conditions and pay. One of the main arguments is that, in this cost of living crisis, the private sector pay has risen to help people, public sector pay not so much. What are the factors behind all of that?
I mean, that's exactly it. And it's worth just kind of looking at public sector and private sector pay. And what you can see here is these two lines, one's the private sector, one's the public sector. They've moved, and this is just the rate at which they're increasing each year. And you can see they've moved in kind of lockstep, more or less, with each other, up to kind of, there's the pandemic there, and then you can see a big divergence. That's the private sector, by the way, there, the red line, and the dark blue line is public sector. But the significant thing is really what's happened recently. That gap has opened up between them, and as a result, this is a lot of what people are talking about right now. Look, private sector wages going up really high, public sector quite weak in terms of wage inflation, but that's only part of it, Part of the story is, what about the levels? If you take a look at the absolute level of your pay, are you getting more in the public sector or more in the private sector? And this chart kind of shows you that. It's looking at the levels. So basically, if the line is somewhere here above in the kind of blue area, then you're talking about public sector pay being more generous than private sector pay. But you've got to adjust. See, you can't just take, the arithmetic totals and say that that's entirely comparable. If you adjust for the fact that you've got different types of workers, you've got different regions of the economy, well, actually, the line looks more like this. So on the basis of that line, look, where we are at the moment, public sector workers are being paid less than their private sector equivalents. I should say invariably it's more complicated than that because that doesn't take into account pensions. But even so, on some measures, it is looking like they are doing worse. So you can see why there is that kind of fight at the moment.
And in this cost of living crisis, we keep hearing the government particularly talking about global factors. So internationally, the strike action in this country, is it being replicated elsewhere?
Well, I mean, short answer, yes, because, we're in a period where you've got inflation going up to these crazy levels, not just in the UK, but elsewhere around the world. And when that happens, in the same way that it did in the 70s, the same way that it did in the 60s, invariably people want higher pay, and that's not necessarily replicated in what they're being given. But one kind of way of getting a sense of how the UK compares across the world, I mean, some of these numbers are quite, take a while to collect, so we won't have the equivalent of the one that I showed you a moment ago, that working days lost for a little bit. But in the meantime, you can look at the percentage of people who are members of trade unions. And here in the UK, this is comparing it all around the world, so Denmark there at the top, and you can see the UK there somewhere in the middle, but actually, interestingly, slightly above the OECD average. But obviously, we all know that that's down a lot from where it was back in, the 70s and the 60s. I'll show you, actually, This was where it was in the 60s. One interesting thing, though, SJ, look at this. So the UK is there, OK? So actually relatively low and only a little bit above the OECD average, although all of these bars are higher. Roll on to kind of where we are at the moment. Look at that red bar. It goes lower, but it's actually kind of getting further up. So compared with other OECD countries, the UK is actually climbing the rankings. So, you know, although we always talk about how the UK actually, in terms of union membership, is really quite low, everywhere else has been getting lower as well, and the UK hasn't been rising quite so fast.
OK, a bit of context and a bit of history as to what we're all experiencing at the moment, whether you're taking part in industrial action or feeling the effects of it. Ed, thank you. Ed Conway, our data and economics editor.